Welcome, everyone. I'm Michael Buttrey. I'm the pastor for discipleship and digital ministry at St. Clement's, and I will be your teacher tonight. We have, I think, an exciting series lined up, 4 weeks, each on a different saint. So for this first week, I wanted to talk a little bit about why did we decide to do this, and then who is Clement, and then a little bit about the text that you have a copy of. I know people have questions about this. The handout I've given you is for the rest of your life. You do not have to cover it tonight.
I stayed up all night.
Good for you. I'll give you extra bonus marks. But I hope that in your discussion groups you can just look at a chapter or two and discuss it. But I tried to pick a variety of things from the letter, which is 65 chapters long. It was a little more verbose than some letter writers of his day. So who are saints? So the New Testament refers to saints over 60 times. The Greek word that is used in the New Testament simply means holy or pure. Holy people, pure people. And in the New Testament, it seems to be just used for Christians, period. So Paul, in his letter to the Corinthians, he writes in chapter 6, verse 2, "Do you not know that the saints will judge the world? And if the world is to be judged by you, are you incompetent to try trivial cases?" So he's equating the saints with you, the audience of the letter to the Corinthians. And that's everybody in the church in Corinth. Paul just says, you're all saints, right? And similarly, when we recite the Apostles' Creed, you may recall it says, we believe in the communion of saints. This, again, is an early document from the early centuries of the church. And it probably just means everyone who is a Christian, right? At that point, the word saints means everyone who's a Christian. But things began to shift a little bit because early Christians began being martyred, that is, killed for their faith. And as this happened, other Christians started to revere these martyrs as exceptionally, ethical, exceptionally holy people. Some Christians began to believe that these martyrs were received immediately into heaven and could pray for people on earth. And so as that reverence for the martyrs grew, the word saints shifted, right? It went from referring to all Christians to these sort of exceptional heroes of the faith. Then things further shifted when the process of canonization, or naming a saint, was developed. So initially, saints were specific to a local area. Rome might have certain saints, and Alexandria would have different saints, right? The church wasn't centralized in its list of saints. But around the 9th, 10th centuries, the medieval Catholic Church started to make it more consistent. And eventually this became the prerogative of the Pope, right? So the Pope set up a process by which the whole church could decide whether this person was a saint. And then everywhere, that person would be a saint. So that's where canonization develops. Fast forward another 6 centuries and we get to the Reformation. And one of the fault lines or divisions of the Reformation is what different Christians thought about saints. So Anglicans and some Lutherans said, saints, yeah, we're down with that. We like saints. Calvinists, Mennonites, and other Protestants said no. So, in other words, there's nothing special about some people being saints, right? We're all saints. And therefore, in another sense, they don't believe in saints in this like restrictive or exceptional way. And then so to this day, different Christian denominations have different stances on, what are saints and how should we commemorate or think about them. Anglicans, however, said, yes, we like saints, and they decided to keep canonizing certain people as saints, even though they were no longer Catholic. So Anglicans commemorate people like John Wycliffe, William Tyndale, and Thomas Cranmer, all of whom criticized the Catholic Church. Obviously, these folks are not saints in the Catholic tradition, right? So although these Anglicans and Catholics and Orthodox all agree, and some Lutherans agree that there are saints, the list of saints starts to diverge. Different churches disagree on who should be considered a saint going forward. Today, there are at least 2,500 canonized saints in Catholicism, which is about 50 for every week. Anglicans have stopped creating new saints, but they commemorate some. So for example, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who we're going to discuss in our fourth and final week, is not a saint. He's also not an Anglican, he was Lutheran. But he is a martyr, he was killed by the Nazis, and he's commemorated in Anglican churches on April 9th. So you have this sort of second category of, holy people, to heroes of faith, to be commemorated without describing them as saints. Another way to put it is the modern Anglican Church has a cautious attitude towards making new saints, right? Whereas the Catholics have continued to do so throughout the last few centuries. Why saints? So if you want to provoke a fight, I'll leave this down for one more second. If you want to provoke a fight, it's not just asking who are saints, but how do we regard them and what do they do, right? So you can ask, for example, do Anglicans specifically venerate saints? Some will say yes, some will say no, and some will say it depends. You can ask questions about, often it's, I think, a misconception that Catholics pray to the saints. Catholics actually specify that they ask saints to pray for people who are alive today. But other people will say, well, that's ridiculous. There's nothing special. Why would you ask a saint to pray for people, right? So there's lots of disagreement about the appropriate attitude towards saints. And then many people find specific saints to be important for their personal piety, right? There are Saint Nettles. There are people who are patron saints of particular professions, particular places. There's kind of a saint for everyone, if I can put it that way. For the purposes of this course, we have a sort of generic minimal definition of saints. They're just godly people in the past that we can learn from and that we can see as an example. That doesn't exclude a higher view of the saints, which you may have, and our Catholic and Orthodox brethren often do. But it doesn't necessitate that, right? You don't have to revere or venerate saints in order to take this series and benefit from it. Then I'll talk a little bit about Clement specifically. So Clement was a Roman man who lived and died in the 1st century. Around 96 AD, which is about 60 years after the crucifixion, he wrote a letter to the Corinthians, much like Paul. And so our reading, the handout I've given you, is excerpts from this letter, this very long letter. When he wrote this letter, Clement was the Bishop of Rome. Now, according to tradition, Peter was the first Bishop of Rome. There's some disagreement over whether Clement was the 2nd, 3rd, or 4th Bishop of Rome. Records were kind of sketchy back then, but everyone agrees that he was a successor of Peter in being the Bishop of Rome. One more comment about Catholicism. In the Catholic Church, the Pope is considered the Bishop of Rome. So Clement is officially the 4th Pope in the Catholic Church. But in the 1st century, I think even many Catholics would say that the Bishop of Rome doesn't have the sort of supremacy over the other churches that would develop later. So Clement isn't a pope in the sense of having that authority yet, right? Even if he's considered a pope by the Catholics later on, it wasn't at that time. The Bishop of Rome was in charge of the whole church. The Bishop of Rome was in charge of the church in Rome. The tradition is that Clement was exiled to work in a mine and then martyred by the Roman Empire by having his neck tied to an anchor, and he was thrown into the sea. It's a bit ghastly, but that's why his symbol is an anchor, and that's why the symbol of this church is an anchor. Anchor is associated with them. Fun facts. For this reason, Clement is the patron saint of mariners. You know, the sea, etc. There is a logic to it. Why are we studying this guy? So, 3 reasons. One is that our church is named after him. According to Joyce Lewis's history of our church was named after a St. Clement Danes in London, England. And that church was named after Clement by the Danes, a seafaring tribe in the 9th century. And they were seafarers, and so they revered Clement because he was the patron saint of mariners, right? You see how it all kinds of fits together. So anyway, since that's the name of our church, and since we have a patronal Sunday every year in November, we thought it'd be a good idea to learn about him. Second, Clement's letter, which we'll get to in a moment, is one of the oldest Christian documents outside of the New Testament. Generally, it's believed that the last books of the New Testament to be written were the book of Revelation and the letters from John. And they were written somewhere between 90 and 110 AD. This letter by Clement was written in 96 AD. So it's contemporary with the oldest books in the New Testament. Or the latest, I should say. Some people in the 5th century argued that 1 Clement should be in the New Testament. But there was no consensus on this, and so it was not. Still, it tells us a lot about the early church. And then the last thing is that there's a couple of specific things that Clement has had a major influence on in Christianity since the writing of his letter. And that doesn't mean that we have to agree with Clement. There's certain things I disagree with in this letter, but we can't avoid his influence. So it's good to kind of know what that is so that we can talk about it. I'm just going to keep barreling on, and then I would love to hear any questions you have. The handout I've given you, as mentioned, is excerpts from the whole letter, which runs to an impressive 65 chapters. The first verse on the first page says, "The church of God, which sojourns at Rome, to the church of God sojourning at Corinth." So this is a letter from Rome to Corinth. And the general gist or context is that apparently the church in Corinth has fallen into division once again. This seems to be a recurring problem in Corinth, and I mean in every church throughout history. But anyway, we know that in Corinth, in 40 years ago, before this letter was written, Paul was writing a letter to the Corinthians that had a very similar problem, and so it seems to have kept happening. Throughout the whole letter, Clement warns against the vices that cause division. He commends virtues that strengthen unity. It seems like the version of Christianity he's interested in focuses on ethics and obedience. That's not all Christians. There's, in Asia Minor, so Turkey, we'll find early Christians are more interested in the Eucharist. And then in Alexandria, early Christians are more interested in philosophy and allegory. But Clement's very, practical, a bit moralistic at times. The most significant, most influential, and most controversial teaching of Clement is apostolic succession. And he discusses this in chapter 44, which is on page 4. And if you'll flip to that, I just want to take a minute before we break to talk about it. So I'll just read it quickly. Chapter 44, our apostles, so he means the apostle of Jesus, also knew through our Lord Jesus Christ that there would be strife on account of the office of the episcopate, meaning bishop. For this reason, therefore, inasmuch as they had obtained a perfect foreknowledge of this, they appointed those ministers already mentioned, and gave instructions that when these should fall asleep, meaning die, other approved men should succeed them in their ministry. Clement, of course, thought that only men could be priests. We are of opinion, therefore, that those appointed by them, or afterwards, by other eminent men, with the consent of the whole church, and who have blamelessly served the flock of Christ, in a humble, peaceable, and disinterested spirit, and have for a long time possessed the good opinion of all, cannot be justly dismissed from the ministry. So, what Clement is arguing, and the reason he's talking about this, is that there's a bit of a schism or rebellion in the church in Corinth, and some of the Christians in Corinth are rejecting the authority of the priests or bishops perhaps that have been appointed to oversee that church. And he's saying this comes straight from the apostles. The apostles appointed their successors, and then so on until there's a line of succession from the first 12 apostles to whoever's in charge of your church right now. And you cannot reject them, and you should not reject their authority. This is a major influence on the majority of the church for the rest of Christianity's existence, right? The idea of apostolic succession continues to this day in the Catholic Church, in the Orthodox Church, and in the Anglican Church, although some Catholics and Orthodox would say that we broke it at some point. And it continues in the office of the bishop, which again exists in these churches, the Anglican, Orthodox, and Catholic, among others. Other churches say, no, we don't need to have an unbroken line of succession from the apostles appointing this person, appointing this person, appointing this person. What's important is that we follow the teachings of the Bible. We follow Jesus, not any human leader, right, who has authority. I'm putting it in kind of theoretical terms, but it has a real practical impact in different churches, especially when you have a leader that is problematic, for lack of a better word, because how can you reject their authority if they were appointed by someone who was appointed by, etc., back to the apostles? So Luther, for example, when he dissented from the Catholic Church, said the Catholic Church had fallen away from the true teachings of Jesus, and Catholics, of course, disagreed, and part of their argument was, we're continuing the teaching of the apostles. There are pros and cons, I think, of different models of leadership. I grew up in the Mennonite Church, so I'm inherently suspicious of having, this big hierarchy, right, of priests, bishops, cardinals if you're Catholic, the Pope, etc. And the Anglican Church also has a bit of this hierarchy. On the other hand, I think many who are used to that position would say, well, if you don't have that, all kinds of stuff happens, right? Look at the explosion of Protestant churches. Churches are constantly splitting, and one person leaves over, or one group leaves over that you changed from chants to hymns, and the next group leaves because you changed from hymns to courses, and then another group leaves over the ordination of women, another group leaves over same-sex marriage. It's just this unending sequence of schism. So yeah, this is kind of just like a microcosm of a letter written a long time ago to one church, and then it ends up growing into this whole tree, which is tragically divided over these and other issues. So I'm not going to settle that debate for you, but I wanted to highlight it to say, well, here's something significant about Clement and his influence. We have the stories about him, we have his patronage of mariners, etc., the way in which he was martyred, and then we also have his teaching. And this chapter in the middle of your handout has an enormous impact, more than anything else probably in the first century, aside from the New Testament itself.